You can lose your fantasy league in the early rounds, but it's your late round picks that win you your league. There's no more variable position than running back. Last season, over a third of week one starters were no longer starting by the playoffs, while Corum Williams, Jerome Ford, Tai Chandler, Devon Achan, and Zamir White turned into league winners. Today, let's beat the waiver wire and get those league winners onto your rosters early on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also check us out on Instagram at The Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and our website is ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can also check out my articles over at football.rasball.com. Today we're talking about running backs, and we are trying to win our league by filling our bench with the most upside running backs available. If you haven't already, make sure you go and check out my last video where I talked about how to structure your dynasty startup leagues. And one of the most important things I talked about in your dynasty startup is making sure that you use your late round picks on upside guys that can win you your league, so that when you bring them off the bench, they're going to come in straight away and they're going to make a huge fantasy impact. And we saw that happen a heap last year. Let's have a look at what we're expecting for this year when it comes to league winning running backs. So, first thing to keep in mind, last year and in general, running backs only started about 14 out of 17 games on average. Running back is a very injury-prone position. In addition, another 4 starters last year just lost their jobs due to their play. That means that a lot of backups end up being fantasy relevant towards the end of the season. We see all of those names popping up on rosters and winning leagues, and a lot of them were guys we predicted. At the start of last preseason, I talked about guys like Jerome Ford. Jalen Warren was a big one for me last season. I also talked about Zach Moss when we knew that Jonathan Taylor was going to miss time. Devin Singletary was already a starter for me in a lot of my leagues. So a lot of these guys are guys we predicted, and the goal is to do exactly the same thing this year. In addition, there were also a heap of backups that came in at parts of last season due to injuries, and we saw a lot of that happening during the playoffs. Zamir White was huge during the playoffs when Josh Jacobs got injured. Tai Chandler came in and actually took the starting job away from what was originally Alexander Mattison and then became Cam Akers. We saw Zack Chabanet come in for Kenneth Walker, for example. A whole heap of these guys came in during the season and made an impact. That meant of the 27 true backups in the league, and some teams don't have true backups, they have committee situations, over half of them was startable at some time during the season. So this is not a case of rolling the dice and hoping you hit on that one guy. Over half of the guys that you pick up will be useful in fantasy. So the goal is to make sure that the guy you pick is the guy with the most upside should the opportunity arise. Let's go through my top 10 upside late round running back picks. Before we go through them, I want to tell you what we're looking for here. The first and most important thing we need is that this running back should have a chance of being a top 24 running back in the league. If that's not going to happen, there's no point in having them on your bench because you're never going to use them. You will hopefully have drafted 2 or 3 good starting running backs. That means you need your bench guys to potentially be just as good as those guys. You don't want bench guys that are simply going to come in and be mediocre if your top guys get injured. If that happens, you've probably lost your league anyway. There's no point in really bothering with that contingency plan. You want guys who are going to come in and threaten your starters and potentially be better and be league winners towards the end of the season. There are a couple of other things we look for in conjunction with that, though. We ideally want a starter in an unstable role. That means there's the possibility that your guy could come in and take the job on merit. So the weaker the starter is, the more likely your guy is to come in and have a role immediately. Ideally, we also want them to be the clear backup. So we don't want a situation where we don't know who the backup is. I'm thinking about, for example, the Khalil Herbert and Roshan Johnson situation in Chicago. Not only is that not a particularly valuable role if one of them wins it, but we have no idea who would be the starter if DeAndre Swift goes down. And while Swift is quite injury prone, if he goes down, it's probably a committee. And even if it's not, we don't know which of those two guys we want. So you want a guy with a clear backup role where you know who'll take over if there's an injury. You don't want a situation where the team might turn it into a committee or might go out and get a veteran to threaten him. You also want a player with a 3-down skill set. There's no point leaving someone on your bench all season only to have them come in and only play 50% of the snaps. You don't want them losing snaps to somebody else. You want your guy to come in and be an every down starter. That's in conjunction with being that top 24 back. They need to be someone with a skill set where they can do it on every down so that if there's an injury, they're going to be used to an extent that's going to win you your league. Ideally, you also want the guy ahead of them to be a little bit injury prone. Now, to me, this is a little bit of a wacky one in that I don't think, for the most part, a lot of running backs are actually injury prone. I think they just play a position where injuries happen regularly. Having said that, there are guys that have regular ankle injuries, guys like Kyren Williams. There are guys that just seem to regularly get soft tissue injuries every season and miss games. I'm thinking guys like Aaron Jones, for example, who misses a couple of games every single season. Some guys aren't injury prone. They just got injured a few times. I'm thinking people like Christian McCaffrey, and some guys are more likely to be injured. And we need to think about that when picking who our bench guys are. Lastly, we also ideally want this to be somebody that you can use in a pinch. So it's a lot less valuable to have an Elijah Mitchell on your bench because realistically, unless Christian McCaffrey goes down, he's not going to be valuable to you at all. He's only going to be getting 2 or 3 points most weeks. On the other hand, if you got someone like, I don't know, Tyler Algier last season, who was obviously behind Bijan, but was still getting 30-40% of the carries and hence was fantasy relevant a lot of weeks, even though he wasn't the starter. That's significantly more valuable on your bench. So these are the things we're going to take into account. Having considered all of these things, here's my top 10 late round running backs. Number 1, my favorite by a mile is Jerome Ford, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, we know the Cleveland O-line is elite. Over the last 5 seasons, they've always had a top 20 running back. Even in the situation where they had to split it between a couple of guys last year, ultimately, Ford still finished as the RB16, and he wasn't even the starter for the whole season. He had to wait till Chubb got injured, and then he took over that role. So that makes him very valuable. We also know that Nick Chubb's only come back on a 1-year prove-it deal. They don't know whether he's healthy or not. So there's a real possibility that Jerome Ford might just take this starting role because Chubb's not as explosive as he used to be. Chubb's not the player he was. Maybe he's not even ready for year 1. We know that players coming off ACL and MCL tears do tend to take a while to get going. And I know the reports have been, wow, Nick Chubb looks amazing coming off his injury, but we've heard that happen before and had players come back and still be pretty average. So there is a real possibility here that either Ford gets some sort of committee role and hence has some sort of bench value for you, even if Chubb doesn't get injured. It's also possible that Chubb's just not ready yet and that Ford comes in and immediately starts from you week 1. Plus, there's also the possibility that Chubb starts and then gets injured and you still have a starter at a Jerome Ford. So there's a massive amount of upside here. They don't have Kareem Hunt anymore. And while it's possible they would go and get someone like that if Ford had to be the guy, I still think that we saw from last year, there's enough upside in being a committee starter in this offense for Ford to be a guy that you absolutely have to have on your rosters if he's available. And I'm talking both in Dynasty and in redraft. We're talking about guys that you should be filling your bench with. So get Jerome Ford on your bench no matter what happens. Obviously, that may change as the offseason goes on and we turn into the preseason and we hear more about Chubb. But for right now, Ford's my number 1 favorite guy. The second guy on my list is Blake Corum, and this is kind of related to that same issue. Firstly, we know that this can be a good run game. We saw it with Kyren Williams last season. He was excellent despite the fact he missed plenty of games last season. The biggest issue with Williams is not his skill set. He's excellent running back. The problem is that he's had consistent foot and ankle injuries. High ankle sprains do not go away. If you've had ankle sprains, you know that those ligaments in that ankle are suddenly significantly weaker and you're more likely to have future ankle sprains. We've seen Williams have high ankle sprains in the last 2 seasons, plus he had a broken foot, and now during OTAs, he's got another foot injury. Now, I'm not saying he'll definitively get injured this season, but I'm saying he's more likely to get injured than other starters. It's very clear that the team knows that. They would not have spent a third-round pick on a running back when they already have a fantastic starter if they didn't recognize the possibility of injury issues and the fact that they need a proper backup because they can't keep using guys like Darrell Henderson and Royce Freeman. Blake Corum comes in. He's got a 3-down skill set. We know how good he was at Michigan. We know that he's going to be good in the red zone. He's good in the passing game. They're talking about wanting him to be a 3-down player. And realistically, if Kyren Williams goes down or if something happens where he's not ready to start the season, Corum is going to have immediate top 10 value. Plus, I still think that this is going to be a little bit of committee. Williams is still the top guy here, but I do think on a week-to-week basis, Corum could get 30 to 40% of the snaps. And that means in a bind on bye weeks, or if you get a whole heap of injuries, you're probably going to be able to start Corum at times during the season anyway. So the upside is huge. The chances of him getting an opportunity is large as well, and he's going to have a little bit of value as well. And that makes him my second favorite late round running back. The only issue with Corum and to an extent Ford is that they're not the latest of late round running backs. You're not going to get them as cheap as you're going to get a couple of these later guys. And that might mean that you want to lean towards these other guys if you're still filling your roster with when guys like Ford and Corum get taken. Number 3 on the list for me is Rico Dable. I'm a little bit confused about what this backfield's going to look like. I know a lot of people are projecting Ezekiel Elliott to be the number 1 guy, and I think on paper that that's the case, but realistically, I think this is going to be a lot more of a committee than it was even 2 years ago when it was Pollard and Elliott. Remember, in that situation, Tony Pollard was really the guy to own. Zeke got a lot of touches, but they were the early down grind work, and he got a little bit of the receiving work. I think he's probably going to get more receiving work this year. So he's going to be the main receiving back because he's so good in pass protection. But I do think that Dowdle's going to get a lot of carries. I think going into the season, we could see Dowdle getting 50, 60% of the touches, even though he's not getting all of the goal line work and a lot of the receiving work. While they're not the most valuable of touches, we're talking about a guy you can take in the last few rounds. And if Ezekiel Elliott goes down with injury, all of a sudden, they have nobody else. Juice Form will come in and be a little bit of a backup. They've got Royce Freeman, but again, he's very much a backup. Dowdle is the guy. It's very clear that they didn't take a single running back out of the draft for a reason. They believe that Dowdle can be someone they can rely on. He's been with the team for 4 years. He's been injured for a couple of those years. He came back and was the clear backup last season, and it wasn't even close. To me, even though this O-line has taken a step back, we're still talking about a guy who in a relatively run-heavy offense is a possible starting running back in this league. And that has a massive amount of upside. After all, Zeke's going downhill. He's a lot older, and he's only on a cheap 1-year deal. I think it's entirely possible that by the start of the season or a couple of weeks into the season, Dowdle is the clear number 1 with Zeke simply backing him up as he did in New England last season. Dowdle has a heap of upside for that reason, though he doesn't have the top 10 upside of guys like Ford and Blake Corum for me. This is a slight drop down from those top 3 guys. Ray Davis is a guy that I like a lot, but realistically, for him to have true value, you're going to need to have an injury to James Cook. James Cook has been good at times in the last couple of seasons, but it's also very clear that the Bills aren't willing to give him a full load. They used a lot of Latavius Murray last season, and they've used a relatively valuable early-ish 4th round draft pick on a running back. And that says something because when they've done that in the past, they've been guys that they used. I'm thinking guys like Zach Moss and Devin Singletary. They're people that they've brought in and actually used when they've used those mid-round picks. So for that reason, I do think that Davis is going to have a role in this offense. James Cook is obviously still going to do what he does. He's going to get a lot of those explosive touches. He's probably going to get 12 to 15 touches each game. But Ray Davis will definitely be involved. And that means even if Cook doesn't get injured, Davis is going to have some value to you. I think that it's very possible that he's the goal line back. Now, that is limited based on the fact that Josh Allen will do a lot of the goal line runs himself. But I also think that Davis has the potential to be the receiving back. He was a solid receiving back in college. I think it's very possible that he comes in and makes that role his own here as well, as we saw a little bit last season with Murray and previously with guys like Fournette. So I do think that Ray Davis has some standalone value, but the biggest value he has is if James Cook goes down. And I know that we don't think of James Cook as being a particularly injury-prone player, but it is always possible because he's a running back. So Davis comes in as a guy who's suddenly going to be an every down starter in an explosive offense with very little competition on the depth chart. Ty Johnson would probably come in and do the third and longs, but Davis would get all the valuable touches if Cook goes down. That makes Davis a possible league winner. We're talking about a guy that I think would be a top 12 running back if we see an injury to James Cook, and that's why you have to put him on your bench in leagues if you have the opportunity. Another guy in a very similar role is Bron Allen. I think that Allen arguably has more upside if Breece Hall gets injured. And we know that Breece Hall has a history of injuries. He's coming off an ACL tear from earlier last season. We do know that he seemed to be fully recovered towards the end of last year. He was very good towards the end of last year. But we do know that that's at least a susceptibility. So it's not impossible to expect that Breece Hall could get injured again. And if that happens, Allen is going to be an every down back. It's been very clear through reports in the preseason that Allen has shined while the others have struggled. Izzy Abanikanda is well down the depth chart. They literally drafted 2 running backs. I do think Isaiah Davis is probably more of a special teams guy who would back up Allen if Allen took that top job. But the main upside in Allen is if there's a Breece Hall injury. He's an excellent receiving back. He's a big back, so they can use him on the goal line. And he might have a little bit of value there if they try to limit Breece Hall's touches a little bit. I think that he'd mainly come in on passing downs and in heavy grinding situations, second and short, third and short, and goal line plays. And those goal line plays are obviously where the touchdown happens. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if Breece Hall loses a couple of touchdowns to Allen during the season, which gives him a little bit of value, especially in best ball leagues. His main value, though, is if Hall gets injured. For that reason, he drops a little bit below Ray Davis for me, because I do think it's possible that Ray Davis turns that situation into more of a committee, or at least into a situation where he at least has a feasible role. I don't think that Bron Allen is going to take a significant amount of snaps away from Breece Hall. I think that he's ultimately always going to be a backup unless Hall gets injured. But gosh, he's a valuable backup if Hall gets injured. He's the number one upside guy if the starter in front of him goes down. And that's why I want him on my bench. We saw that with Tyler Algier last season, the same thing happened. He was the valuable backup to Bijan, and yet he ended up with a rather large role because Arthur Smith went entirely nuts. That's kind of what I'm projecting could happen in Buffalo. I don't think it's going to happen again in Atlanta. A lot of the talk has been that they're expecting to use Bijan Robinson as much as possible. Now, that could just be coach speak. That could be just trying to say what the fan base wants to hear. But I do think that Robinson is going to get a heavy load of snaps. We do know, however, that Algier can be pretty valuable if Bijan goes down. And he also still had some boom weeks last season when they were well ahead in games, or they just gave him a little bit of the load to take it off Bijan. So it is possible that it'll happen at times during the season, but his main value here is if Bijan goes down, suddenly you've got a guy who can be a league-winning running back. I think that if you've got no Bijan, all of a sudden in Algier, we've got a guy who can arguably be a top 12 running back, and that's why he has so much upside, and that's why I rank him ahead of a lot of the other guys. He's an every down back. They've got no one else that's really threatening on the depth chart. I do think someone like an Avery Williams could do the third and longs. Jason McClellan is a guy they brought in the 6th round. I don't think he threatens even if Bijan gets injured. I think it's going to be all Algier, and for that reason, he's a guy that I want on my roster, especially if I've got a relatively deep bench, because then I can take more punts on guys that I don't actually need to start. So he sits in right behind Bron Allen in those upside guys who probably aren't going to have every down use or any usage if the starter is not injured. Tai Chandler is going to have a lot more value during the season. And I do think we saw towards the end of last year just how good he can be. They brought in Aaron Jones on a rather expensive deal. He's a proven player and he can be very explosive, but Aaron Jones has very rarely carried a heavy load. Through most of his time in Green Bay, he really only played 40 to 60% of snaps. He was very good on those snaps, but he was more of an efficient player than a heavy down player. For that reason, I think that Tai Chandler is going to be involved, and I'd expect him to probably play 30 to 50% of the snaps, even when Jones is healthy. We also know that Aaron Jones has a long history of missing games due to injury. It's very rare for him to play a full season. For that reason, I do think there's a good chance that Chandler just takes over this role. Plus, if you look at that depth chart, there is no one behind these top two guys. Both of these guys have big upside, because if the other one gets injured, all of a sudden they're going to get a very heavy load. Now, it is possible that they do bring in a veteran or someone else to support. I think that if one of them goes down for the season, that's very possible. But I do think in Tai Chandler, we've got a guy with a whole lot of upside who we know can do it. And we know that he's impressed them in OTAs and they want him to have a role anyway. So he's someone that you can probably use if you're desperate on a bye week, and he's got a heap of upside if Aaron Jones gets injured. I also think that Aaron Jones also has a heap of upside. You're just paying so much more for him compared to Chandler, who you can get in the relatively late rounds. I also don't think it's impossible that if the Vikings season starts to go downhill a little bit, they decide that there's no point in giving carries to a guy who's on a one-year deal, who's aging, who they're probably not bringing back. It might be they just give the starting role to Chandler. I don't think that's impossible either, and that's kind of part of his upside. Right behind him is a guy who I think of all of these guys, or certainly of the last five or so, is the most likely to actually take a starting role. The problem is, it's a starting role with the Broncos. And I think the Broncos are probably going to be pretty bad this year. I'm expecting them to probably be among the bottom five teams. And for that reason, having their running back isn't overly valuable. When they were good, you wanted the Broncos running back. But last season, we saw, firstly, it was a bit of a messy committee. And secondly, there was a situation where even when the running back was getting a lot of carries in Javonte Williams, wasn't really able to make the most of them. Jalil McLaughlin looked the most explosive of their running backs last season, and I expect that they probably want to use him in that change of pace role. However, Cecil Lammey, who is the team reporter for the Broncos and is one of the most accurate team reporters in the league, has come out and said that Jalil McLaughlin is the only guy locked in on this roster and has a clear role, and it is possible he'll be the starter in week one, and that it's possible Javonte Williams won't make the roster at all. Now, this whole situation is pretty messy. They obviously brought in Audric Estime in the draft, and I do think that he's going to be involved, and I think Samaje Perine probably still takes the late down stuff. So McLaughlin kind of comes in as a very different player to the previous four we looked at. I think his upside is massively capped, and I think it's going to be hard, even if he's the clear starter, for him to break the top 24. But I do think there is more likelihood of him being the starter than all of these other guys. So if you're in a situation where you've gone zero RB, or you're very strong with wide receivers and tight end, and you just need someone who's going to give you a bunch of points during the season, isn't going to be a top end guy, but is going to offer you something, I think McLaughlin's more likely than any of the previous four guys that we talked about to offer you that baseline of points. And I think there's more chance of that happening. I would say 30 to 40% chance that he's a relevant fantasy starter going into week one of the season. That's not a very high probability, but you're paying practically nothing for him. And for that reason, he's worth stashing on your bench. I also do think that there's some trade upside here. I think if he goes into the season and in week one, he's the clear starter, all of a sudden you're going to have a lot of people wanting to trade for McLaughlin. And for that reason, you're probably able to get some value out of that, because there might be other people who don't recognize his lack of true upside. We also have to consider the fact that Javonte Williams only has 1 year left on his rookie deal. McLaughlin is a guy who's going to be around for a while longer. So in Dynasty, McLaughlin also has more upside because he might become the longer-term starter. So if you're thinking about Dynasty, you also want guys who are going to give you long-term value. And for that reason, I think McLaughlin offers something there as well. Now, Zack Chabanet goes in the total opposite direction. I think he's a true backup to Walker. Last season, he was playing nearly 50% of the snaps, but most of his snaps were on passing downs. They obviously trust this guy in pass protection, but not so much to actually carry the ball. Kenneth Walker is still the clear number one guy, but I do think that Chabanet has enough of a role that you can use him on bye weeks if necessary. And obviously, he has a big amount of upside if Walker goes down. Because if you look at the rest of their depth chart, they're mostly names you don't even recognize. Kenny McIntosh has never taken a snap in the NFL. George Holani was an undrafted free agent this season, and he was one of the better running back undrafted free agents, but still didn't even get drafted. And Ricky Person Jr. came across from the UFL. So we're not talking about big names here. There realistically are 2 running backs on this roster, and that's it. And we've seen that the Seahawks running game can be quite valuable over the years. Kenneth Walker's been top 20 the last 2 years, and he's missed multiple games each of the last 2 years. That's great for Chabanet because Walker's missing games, and it also shows that he's a consistently good running back in this offense, and hence that if Chabanet gets the opportunity, because Walker goes down for longer term, he can suddenly become valuable. I also think in Dynasty long term, we are still talking about a day 2 draft pick. So there is some upside here that at some stage Walker will move on and Chabanet takes over the lead role. So I think in Dynasty, he's someone that you need to hold on to your roster. In redraft, he's someone that I'm tempted to take late on. I do just think that there's less chance of him actually taking the full role. And I think there's a slightly limited upside in this offense compared to some of the other guys like your Bron Allens that we talked about earlier. And my number 10. Antonio Gibson obviously went across to the Patriots this year, and we've seen the Patriots do a whole lot of wacky things with running backs. If you look at their best running backs finished the last 5 years, 4 different players. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen again this year. I don't expect that Gibson takes over the number 1 role, but we saw Stevenson get injured last year. The weirdest thing that the Patriots did was go and actually give Ramondre Stevenson a 4-year contract extension. Now, I'm positive that there's not guarantees all the way through that. I think that realistically that actually only locks him in probably until about 2026. But that's still a long time for a running back. And Stevenson's gone up by dynasty rankings a reasonable amount because of that contract. We know that Stevenson can be very good. He's obviously a top 10 running back from only a couple of years ago. But I do think that Gibson is going to have a role here. We know that he's a converted wide receiver. We know that he's been a former top 12 running back, which is funny to think, but it is the case when he was in Washington. So I do think there is a situation here where Gibson takes a fair chunk of the receiving work away from Stevenson. And that means that he at least has some upside. The downside, of course, is that Stevenson is entrenched in his role, and you'll need an injury to Stevens before Gibson can come in. And even if Gibson comes in there, we are still talking about a team with a weak O-line, with little touchdown upside, and they still are guys like Kevin Harris, who I do think they'll give some carries to if Gibson came in as the starter because Stephen was injured. So this is kind of one of those mid-range ones where there's upside if he takes the starting job, but it's limited upside. There's a higher chance of him taking the starting job, but he's not going to earn it on merit because Stevenson just got that big contract. He does offer some week-to-week value, but that's offset by the fact that I'm not sure he has the same high-end value if he gets the starting job, and that's why he just scrapes into my top 10. There are a couple of honorable mentions I wanted to talk about as well. Chuba Hubbard is someone who I think could be quite valuable early in the season. I don't think Jonathan Brooks is going to be fully recovered from injury, and for that reason, I think that Hubbard might get quite a few carries early on, but I still think Brooks is going to be involved. I don't think there's a significant risk of Brooks missing week 1. And we're talking about the Panthers offense. Their running game has been solid for a long time, but it's not exactly league winning solid. It's not like when Chuba Hubbard was the starter last season, he's someone you desperately wanted on rosters. And for that reason, it's not someone I'm going out of my way to get. I do think he's still a clear backup, though. These are just in alphabetical order by team, by the way. These aren't in order of preference. Dameon Pierce was really disappointing last season. We expected him to be the starter and lost the job almost immediately to Devin Singletary, as predicted in the last preseason on this channel. I do think Pierce now is still the clear backup, though, and I think if something happens to Joe Mixon, which it could, that Pierce would still come in and be the every down guy. They have been talking him up, but I think that's mostly coach speak. Clyde Edwards-Helaire I like quite a lot in KC. They've got nothing behind him. We know that he can be an every down back. He's a good receiver, but Isaiah Pacheco is still the clear guy there. And that running back position in KC is not actually as valuable as it should be in that offense because Patrick Mahomes is such a good passer. So for that reason, Edwards-Helaire falls in next behind a lot of these guys. He's probably 11 or 12 for me. I'm just not convinced that they wouldn't bring someone in if Pacheco went down for the season. I don't know if they'd really trust Edwards-Helaire, and then they'd have absolutely no backups because they've got no one behind CEH. Alexander Madison is the backup in Vegas, but he's not a true backup. I do think that we're going to see some receiving work from either Amir Abdullah or the rookie Dylan Lowry. For that reason, that limits Amir White a little bit, and it also limits Madison. We've seen Madison have a chance last year with the Vikings. He wasn't particularly good. I think that he is not a true upside backup, and for that reason, he's behind a lot of these other guys. Tyrone Tracy Jr. is the guy in New York, and I don't think it's impossible that he wins the starting role on merit, but I do think that they're expecting it to be Devin Singletary as their starter this season. He nearly made it into my top 10 and I only dropped him out when I realized I'd forgotten Tai Chandler. He is probably my number 11. I do like the upside here because he's talented, but he is an older rookie. He played, I think, 6 years in college. He's like 24 or something like that. He's a converted wide receiver, so his pass protection's not great. And I also don't think that he's the clear backup. I think Eric Gray's kind of battling him for that position. I think Tracy probably wins out, but because there's not the security there, it does drop him down a little bit for me. But he does at least have the upside of potentially winning that starting role in New York. Elijah Mitchell is a little bit further down to me than most would expect. The reason for that is twofold. Firstly, he started to lose touches to Jordan Mason last season, and I don't particularly rate Mason. I just don't think that they see him as the clear number one backup. They also drafted a third-round rookie in Isaac Guerendo. I do think Guerendo opens the season as a kick returner. I'll talk about that in my next video, which will be more recent NFL news and how it's going to affect Dynasty. Guerendo is going to have a role, but it's going to be mostly on special teams. But it's not impossible that during the season, he slowly takes over that backup role. And certainly if CMC goes down, it wouldn't surprise me if it's a committee and if Mitchell's not excellent, that they start giving a lot more touches to the backups. So that limits Mitchell's upside. And that's why I wouldn't go out of my way in getting him. I don't think he's one of the high value backups, even though that is a valuable role in the San Fran offense. Now, there are a couple of guys that people are drafting that I would avoid. I don't think these are valuable running back backups. I think these guys are all capped for different reasons. So let me take you through my reasoning in each of these guys. Firstly, and these are once again just in alphabetical order by team. Keaton Mitchell in Baltimore. My issue here is I don't think he's actually a clear backup. I think he's a change of pace back who offers something a little bit different to Derrick Henry. But if Henry goes down, I don't think Mitchell necessarily takes over a lead role. I think he becomes a committee back where we see a lot of Justice Hill as the receiving back and the passing down back. And we also see a little bit of Rasheen Ali as that heavier back. So I don't think there's a situation, even if Henry goes down, where Mitchell becomes the league winner. In Chicago, it's just too up in the air who the actual number one is. Even if DeAndre Swift wasn't there, how high would we be valuing Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson? I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect they'd probably be somewhere in the 30s. The problem is they're currently being drafted in the 50s for running backs. I think in Dynasty, there's upside there because they're both guys who've proven they can be starting running backs, and therefore they might get some opportunities elsewhere. But in redraft, their chances this season of getting a lead role are low, not only because Swift will need an injury, which is possible, but we don't know which of them would take over the lead role if that injury occurs. And that massively limits their upside. Or I should say it limits their ability to achieve their upside. They're less likely to be the starter. And even if they get a starting role, are they a true starter or is it a committee? So I'm just avoiding those guys in general. I think Swift is the only guy in Chicago's running back room I'm interested in. Samaje Perine was a top 50 running back last year, but he's never going to be a top 30 running back, for example. His upside is capped as a receiving back. There have been some receiving backs over the year. I'm thinking guys like Nyheim Hines, Tariq Cohen, James White, who've been very valuable because they have a true every passing down role. Jerick McKinnon has been a more recent guy. That's not Samaje Perine. He is involved, but he doesn't play every single passing down. They don't use him a lot around the goal line, and therefore, for that reason, he is massively limited. Plus, they're trying to restructure that whole running back room, and I don't think he's one of the options they're considering for early downs. I think he's more likely to have no role than some role. And so unless you're in an extremely deep league where teams across your league are starting the 60th and 70th running backs off the board, I don't think there's really much upside in Perine. In Green Bay, Josh Jacobs is the clear number one guy. And he's only, 26 years old or something like that. He's still got a few years ahead of him. I don't think they're thinking of these guys as anything more than a backup. We saw when they had Aaron Jones in the league role, they went out and drafted AJ Dillon on day 2. I think this is just a repeat of that same process. I think they're bringing in another backup to challenge the leader, but realistically, Marshawn Lloyd is just a backup. And I'm not convinced that he's a very valuable backup. I think that if Josh Jacobs goes down, which is very possible, I still think we see a little bit of AJ Dillon. He is still on the team. He is someone that they're willing to give touches to. I think this could be an awkward committee if you get a Jacobs injury. And for that reason, I'm not willing to pay for Marshawn Lloyd. I just don't think the value's there. Jalen writes another one where if you get an injury, and I don't know who would be the one getting injured, but if it's either Raheem Mostert or Devon Achane, I don't know which of those two guys would lead to Jalen Wright having a clear role. I think probably you'd want Mostert to be the guy who's injured, but I think if that happens, you do see Wright more involved, but you still see Achane as the starter, and you probably see a lot more of Jeff Wilson than you'd want to see. If Achane's the one who gets injured, then Wright probably comes into that similar role, but you still see a whole lot of Mostert. I think they're seeing Wright as more of a long-term option. I think he has some value in Dynasty, but in redraft, I'm not particularly interested in putting him on my bench. I also think people are overpaying for him. So even in Dynasty, you're not going to get good value for him. I think the upside is limited, and his chances of achieving that upside is also a little bit limited as well. I think there's a good chance we end up with a committee, even if someone like Mostert goes down, which is probably his best case scenario from a fantasy perspective. In New Orleans, it's a total mess. I know that we talked about in my last news video, Alvin Kamara potentially holding out and that being offering some upside for Kendre Miller and Jamal Williams. There is some upside there, but realistically, it's hard to achieve because Kamara would need to not play. And even if it happens, we don't know who's the clear starter. Jamal Williams was clearly in front of Kendre Miller last year. And I don't think we can safely say that Miller's now in front of Williams. There's no reason to believe that's the case. We haven't heard anything to suggest that's the case. We haven't seen anything to suggest he's earned it. I think this could be another situation where Kendre Miller just turns into a bust. I think that's realistically possible. And even if Alvin Kamara gets injured, I think even if Miller gets an opportunity, it's going to be in some sort of a committee. So I don't think there's the upside there, and I don't think the upside is accessible enough to make up for the fact that Miller is not going into a clear role. Kenneth Gainwell was the clear backup in Philly last season. I don't think that's the case this season. Firstly, they brought in Saquon Barkley, who I think they're probably going to be willing to give a slightly heavier load to than DeAndre Swift. Funnily enough, Kenny Gainwell was actually the starter in week 1 last season, but he got injured. And I think he really fell off as the season went on. I think they realized that he's really not the guy they can lean on. They were very clear going into the NFL draft that they wanted to have 2 good running backs they could use. I think there was a hope that would be Gainwell, but they brought in Will Shipley. And I think they see Shipley as being the guy to use in conjunction with Saquon Barkley. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see a little bit of Shipley, but I do think even if Saquon goes down, Kenneth Gainwell doesn't become the clear lead back. I also don't know that Will Shipley necessarily becomes the clear lead back, but I think he has more upside than Gainwell does. So Shipley's someone I'm willing to take very late in dynasty drafts. I wouldn't be interested in him in redraft because I don't think the upside's there. And I don't want Kenneth Gainwell in any league particularly. I just don't see a clear path to relevance to him. And Isaac Guarendo's the last guy I mentioned. I already talked about Elijah Mitchell. Guarendo's probably a special teams guy this year, so you don't want him in redraft. You probably realistically don't want him in dynasty. A couple of guys I just didn't mention at all. I didn't talk about the Chargers because, well, firstly, I don't think of them as backups, really. We don't know who the starter is, but I don't think anyone's an obvious backup. I think it's probably a committee for all of them. And for that reason, I don't think you're really drafting them as backups. And I think the upside is capped. I think whoever the starter is, unless they're an every down starter, I don't think any of these guys will be. I think the main guy will probably end up in the 20s somewhere, and the others will probably end up in the 30s and 40s. When I talk about the others, I'm talking about Gus Edwards, I'm talking about J.K. Dobbins, I'm talking about Kamani Vidal. I think they're the main 3 guys there. I think Vidal's being overdrafted because he's a rookie, and that's exciting. I think it's mainly Gus Edwards, and we've seen what Gus Edwards generally is. He's an early down guy with no receiving work. They don't have a clear receiving back on the roster. I do think that's going to be a total mess. I don't particularly want any part of it, but I'm also not avoiding it because if I'm doing a 0 RB strategy, they could be valuable in that range as someone I can at least use until one of my backups hits. So that has been our running back backup show. One thing I did want to plug is I'd offer draft assistance going into the season, whether it's dynasty or redraft. I can personalize rankings specific to your league. Every league is different, and your rankings, and especially how you rank certain positions against each other, will depend on a couple of things. Firstly, we care about what roster you're starting. How many running backs do you start? How many wide receivers? How many flex positions? What's your scoring settings? Is it PPR or half PPR? Do you have bonus points for random stuff? Is it super flex or tight end premium? All of those things that we talk about considering going into your drafts, I can cater into your specific rankings. That's something that no site does. You will always have to get someone to personalize rankings if you want your rankings to be accurate. And I offer that for a very special price of only $10 US. So hit me up on my email, benwasley23@gmail.com, and I can personalize rankings for you. If you want to just even talk about it and get some more details, feel free to email me. I'm happy to help you out. You can also DM me on my socials as well. All my social details are down the bottom there. Instagram @thefantasyfirstdown, Twitter @fantasyfirstdown with no O. Obviously, you can also check out my rankings that are just more generic at ffdfantasyfootball.com. And obviously, you can check out all the other stuff I'm doing here on YouTube as well. I also do a heap of articles over at football.rasball.com. And they've also brought in a whole heap of extra tools that you can use on Radfootball that I find particularly useful. I think at this time of the season, the most valuable one is their depth chart tool. Not only does it say what the depth chart's going to be, it also says how many touches, what percentage of the snaps each of those players is going to get. They have really accurate projections over there. Rudy Gamble has been very accurate at doing that for many years. And for that reason, I use a lot of the Rasball stuff to help me in my rankings as well. And I suggest you do the same. If you've got any other questions, feel free to leave them in the comments or DM me on any of those social media platforms or chuck us an email as well. I look forward to coming back and bringing you another video in the coming days when we're going to talk about any of the latest OTA news and what impact that's going to have on our dynasty rankings. I will see you then.